a great honor for us, my team and I, to present today an extraordinary exhibition in conjunction with the 19th Architecture Biennale. The Next Earth, conceived together by Antikythera and MIT Architecture. This exhibition continues and underlines Palazzo Diedo's focus on the most pressing and urgent contemporary issues in all disciplines, including architecture. The next and first panel of today introduces the exhibition with the four curators who conceived it. Benjamin Bratton, who is the director of Antikythera program at the Berggruen Institute. Zhong is a designer, fabricator, who is engaged at the MIT. Nicolay Monchaux, who is professor and head of architecture at MIT. Miljacki is professor of architecture at MIT, and Nicolay Boyadjiev as well at Antikythera. So I leave the stage to you.
So I guess I'll go first. I just want maybe just welcome all of us here to this. We wanted to keep these conversations that we'll be doing today, there's quite informal. And so there really isn't a formal presentation. It's just a chance for us to talk a little bit about the ideas and process that eventuated into the exhibitions that you see today. The first panel today will be with the curators. We will then, after, as in the calendar, we'll be doing Antikythera will be doing two panels to celebrate the launch of the journal that we are developed with MIT Press, and then at the end of the afternoon, before we wrap up, a book discussion with Blaise Aguirre-Arcos as part of our book series. But I think we thought for this first panel here, we have five really interesting people who I think all maybe see this exhibition slightly differently, and the goals and criteria for what we try to accomplish here somewhat differently, and what we have here is really the sum of those perspectives. It's hopefully greater than each of the individual ones. So I think really what we want to do at the time is a chance for each of us to talk a little bit about what we've done, what we see, and then sort of see what maybe things align. So maybe with that, I'll ask Nicholas for you to kind of start us off, and then I'll pick up the rear.
Absolutely. Well, I want to, first of all, thank all of you for coming today. Very much thank our hosts, Berggruen Arts Culture, for offering us this opportunity. This conception of this exhibit began more than a year ago in conversations with Nicholas Berggruen and with Benjamin, and with the idea that the larger values and goals and questions that Berggruen is asking and that Antikythera is asking about where we are in the world, how we conceive of and understand the moment of crisis we're in related to climate and all of the other effects it has, how we think of, in particular, of design as an architecture, as an agent in this space to help both unveil and move us towards adjacent possibilities that we need to occupy. All of these values and goals are very much shared, and that made sense to stage this conversation, or to continue to have this conversation in the physical space of Diedo here over the course of the Architecture Biennale. Of course, as a collateral event with the larger conversation. So I'm incredibly grateful to our hosts and collaborators, and also to, of course, the co-curators of the exhibit, Benjamin, Nicolay, Anna, and Calvin, for an incredible piece of teamwork over the last year. And then in our particular case, I also have to thank all of our faculty. The exhibit you see upstairs represents a conversation not just with the exhibit that you see here of Antikythera, but it represents, I remember one particular point in our planning conversations when I had to make very clear that this was a conversation between Antikythera and another conversation, which is a constant conversation and argument and emergent kind of collaboration that happens across an academic department like MIT, which at the intersection of practice and research and thinking about the future of architecture through how we instrumentally change it, each piece you see upstairs in a way that my co-curators will talk about it represents a specific overlapping set of obsessions with all of the other obsessions that our faculty have. And so this conversation has been really enlarged and defined by each one of our faculty who have declared and created a world of their own research and conversation upstairs. So I have to thank all of them too. So with that, maybe I'll give it over to Anna and Calvin to talk a little bit more about what we're doing.
Do you want us to do that? Or have the Earth present
we'll
in some different way?
We'll tag team.
Yeah, so I'm going to join in the thanks and thank all of you for coming to hear us. Hopefully we, give you something to walk away with that's useful. But so in the MIT case, what we've been thinking about is that really across that body of faculty work is that climate crisis is everywhere. It is multi-layered. It is hard to pin down. It is hard to understand. And yet all the work, because it is that way, because climate crisis is a multivalent and entangled problem, or maybe not problem, but reality, all the work that we do is related to it. In some cases, we have to narrate a longer line or a story from some of the work that our faculty is doing to figure out how it participates or betters the situation. In some cases, the things are immediate and they are sort of understood colloquially already as having to do with climate crisis. So to just, in a way, then unpack a little bit the title, climate work is then all the work that we do at MIT is related to climate in some way, and we're figuring it for you in the exhibition above. And then the subtitle of Unworlding the Planet is relevant for us because every research project assumes a world and worlds in some way. And then we also have to think of the work that is interested in and dedicated to unworlding or undoing some of the things that we have already produced so that we can make room for new and other worlds to come. So that's a kind of an important story about the title. What we wanted to do in the exhibition is also sample in, therefore, research from the school as it's going on right now. Not as a kind of heroic and solutionist kind of proposition, but as basically inquiry that is happening right now, hopefully leading and sometimes intertwining across the desks that you will see, if you haven't already, to produce possible solutions, possible realities, possible futures, the way that some of our science fiction writers think about science fiction. That's enough for now, maybe.
Go ahead, Calvin.
Yeah, I mean, I think in our exhibition, I think I have a kind of personal involvement in being first a student, first entering MIT as really thinking about the science and engineering of it all, and starting with from Larry Sass's work of panelizing housing to then joining, Collective Architecture Studio and collaborating with Nicholas on Green City Force. I think I started to understand this idea of computation and the tools that we learn about and that I've grown with here to produce that in my own practice and in the curation of the exhibition, a kind of multiple worlds that we can start to occupy through architecture and apply these various research initiatives into architecture, right?
Nicolay, maybe I ask you to talk a little bit about the piece that we see here and that kind of the construction process and maybe where it fits together, and then I'll talk a bit about Neoscene and some of the bigger ideas.
Yeah, for sure. I don't have much to add in terms of the introduction. I think that we can talk about the new scene in the topics shortly. Just to add something to also a word you mentioned, Anna, on sampling and samples. This was very much also part of our logic of thinking through the exhibition design and thinking about the presentation of the work really as iterative and really compartmentalized, presented by way of this interface that we've built here. And I think to some extent the space above also acts as. So Antikythera's work, the challenge of our work is basically how do you visualize, how do you present philosophical ideas in a format like this? How do you represent concepts and books and a new vocabulary? Therefore, for us, it was strategic. But I think overall, the concept of samples, and I think bigger than that, the concept of architecture itself, perhaps as a subset of interface design, could be an interesting component during the conversation as well.
So I'm going to maybe say a few words about the Neoscene exhibition and some of the inspiration behind that. We have an ambitiously tight schedule today, so I'm going to make sure Haley keeps us on track, and you'll give me the high sign when we should stop here. So I'm not an architect. I've taught in architecture schools for some time, though I've always been deeply fascinated with architecture because to me it's been sort of one of an extraordinarily intelligent and elegant way to think about how it is that complex systems are produced, how it is that humans and other creatures artificialize their environment and make the world in the image of the intelligence that they bring to it. The moment in which we find ourselves is one in which what we call computation or computational technologies is arguably the primary means by which both that intelligence constructs itself, but also the way in which that artificialization of the world manifests itself. And what we were interested in exploring then is, in particular, the role of computation as what we might call an epistemological technology, how it is that we discover things about the world, about the universe, and indeed about ourselves through the investigations that are mediated through computational means. Which means that to ask the ways in which computation contributes to what we might call cosmology. Now, in English, cosmology has at least two connotations. One is, when I ask my friends in the astrophysics department about cosmology, they tell me about, it's about black holes and space-time continuum and so forth. And friends in the anthropology department, when you ask about cosmology, it refers to how it is that a culture understands their place in the world and the meaning that they derive from that understanding and the place in the world. And in certain times, those two forms of cosmology are quite closely linked. How a culture understands scientifically how the world works and how it understands itself in that world may be quite aligned. At other points in times, they're actually quite divergent from each other. And I think arguably we are at a time of dangerous divergence. And part of the crisis that we identify and that we find ourselves in is both the cause and result of that divergence. Just to maybe quickly point your attention to a couple of the artifacts in the back beyond this mesmerizing aquarium of ideas above my head are two artifacts that try to demonstrate a kind of continuity between this relationship of calculative technologies and cosmology. We have the first atlas, the comprehensive atlas of astronomic thought of the post-Copernican era, the Harmonia Macrocosmica from 1662. An incredibly inspiring example of how a kind of a Copernican turn, a revolution by which we are forced to understand that the world doesn't actually work the way it appears to us, becomes not just a scientific revolution, but a cultural revolution as well, that is synthesized into a coherent world, as Anna and Calvin would have it. And on the other, we have an example of where they don't convene. An original print of the first image of Earth from the moon, and the interview with the notorious German philosopher Martin Heidegger, at which point when presented with this image, he kind of unravels, becomes quite shaken, and refuses the implications of the image, and demands, in essence, that it be banished from consideration, a reactionary refusal of the Copernican turn. This is the moments by which these cosmologies kind of diverge. So the hope, at least for us, is to understand ways in which these might actually align. That is, how is it possible that our understanding of how a planet works and our understanding of the worlds in which we occupy might actually cohere again and might not be quite so much at odds? Not only conceptually, theoretically, philosophically, but as the basis of the kinds of design that we do, the kinds of remaking of the world that we do within this as well. It seemed to me this is a kind of precondition to working our way out of the crisis into something that might come next. Please.
Well, no, I mean, there's maybe to try and tie what you just said, Benjamin, back to the point that Anna was making about how we create worlds through architecture. There was an interesting moment in the context of historic artifacts in, I think it was 1962, when the computer scientist Werner Buchholz was talking about a new IBM computer in the 7030 in an article in a trade magazine, and he said, well, I need a way to talk about computation and how to configure computation and what it thinks about that allows us to think of things differently and arranging the parts of a computer in a way that we've never done before. And so I'm going to take the word architecture, and I'm going to use this word architecture in the context of computation for the first time. And now we talk about software architecture all the time and use architect as a verb, and all of these things actually trace back to this one single point in this in the history of ideas when that word was borrowed. But I think that goes to the point that you opened with, Benjamin, about what a kind of powerful way of thinking about the world architecture is. I think we can be proud as architects about how it is borrowed to think about a sense of fundamental reconfiguration, not only in the context of computation, but in the context of how we might reorient our use of resources, how we might be more circular, as many of our faculty work shows, in our use of materials, etc. But I also think there's a flip side to that, which I think Anna was getting to as well, which is that the architects also need to rethink how we think about architecture, in that our profession is in many ways traditionally or diagrammatically grounded on the extraction of resources from the ground and their reconfiguration into a new building. This is certainly how we teach architecture conventionally, and then the occupation of that building by a certain program. And to me, one of the most important characters of many of the different conceptions of the world that our faculty create upstairs is a disorientation from that kind of traditional mode of thinking about architecture, and whether it's through the circular use of materials, whether through its different relationship of resources, often facilitated by novel uses of computation in the context of Caitlin or Sheila's work or Sandy's work, how we think about how new modes of computation allow us to orient our attitudes towards the life of materials differently, Juliana's work as well. To me, the notion of I talk this way in the context of the conversation about computation, about re-architecting architecture, is also a very important one.
I mean, maybe to take it back to, slightly away from computation in its current technologically enabled sense, and to world making more generally. So I do think that what is important about these two shows being in conversation is this idea of a kind of attunement of local grounded world thinking and the planetary. And so in that sense, I agree. I think this is something you called it differently, sort of alignment between cosmology and computation, or the kind of a transformative Copernican moment and cosmology. I do think that this is, so our attempt upstairs is that we enable, in a way, all of the worlding that is happening through research to be that, because it has to be grounded in some way, and to then talk about the ways in which the work and the research is attempting to re-architect its relationship to the planetary, or at least to understand it. This is something that Anna Tsing calls attunement, a kind of attunement between the local knowledge and the planetary understanding, or the understanding of the local kind of effects on the planetary level, which I think is important for both of us in some way, maybe through different set of vocabularies. But
I wonder what I wonder what you mean by the local. And this would, for you, is the I mean, and I mean this in a quick, genuine sense. Is the local? There's a vernacular form of local, which would imply a kind of spatial coherent, like the space by which there's an anthropocentric local
I mean it
by
both
which one person's in.
geographically, but more importantly, epistemologically, right? So every research project assumes a certain kind of obviously has a certain kind of epistemological proposition, and I would say imagines a world and begins to world by producing the research. So for me, that's the local that I mean right now. But some of that is also local to the particular kind of question and world that the research is producing. But I also, in some cases, this is in fact local in the kind of colloquial sense of geography. That there are certain things that are.
So that sounds more like that's like location. It's the location of something, right? That there's a specificity of a location that requires a certain prioritization of certain kinds of variables and frameworks. This seems completely logical, which may or may not coincide with the folk logic of the local. Yeah, right.
If I can add actually something to that, because as a trained architect or as a recovering architect, or as the closest to an architect that we have in the Antikythera constellation, it's kind of forced me to think a little bit more in line with these ideas and in line with the topic of computation, forced to rethink the definition or perhaps the interpretation of the discipline. And at least my thinking around this, using an analogy to computation being sort of medium agnostic, matter computes, different matter computes differently. It doesn't mean that all matter computing is as good as any other matter computing. Similarly to this, I think if you think again as architecture as a form of interface design or a relationship rather than a thing, it is about essentially an alignment, often site-specific alignment between culture, social needs, etc., and the ecological substrates that connect us. And this kind of the universal, where we sometimes the sort of preceding universality or the universality from below of the planetary condition is, as opposed to thinking of the universals on top at the cultural layer, it's essentially about interpreting the universal layer as the one below and thinking of architecture as a relationship. So yes, it's local in that sense, but in terms of a sort of relationship to, if you think of architecture as an interface between those two poles, of course, the site specificity matters. Of course, not all materials are as good as any other materials in one or the other context. So I think that the local and the universal don't need to be opposites in that sense at all.
Just to quickly add on to this as well, like maybe this distinction you make between the notion of the universal as a kind of socio-cultural universal, which a deeply anthropocentric, anthropomorphic universal, a kind of social reductionist, cultural determinist notion of the universal, versus the what we call the precedent universal, which like literally the universe, like the physical and material conditions that make possible intelligent creatures that have worlds. That in a way, this is the distinction between the global and the planetary. And the significance of the planetary in relationship to the global is the distinction between those two universals. I'm just riffing, but sounds good.
Yes, and architecture's role within that is to be determined, especially now that we are aware of that distinction.
Is the sun right?
I mean, I think there's an assumption in the way you set up that question, though, Nicolay, which I think a lot of the work going on in our department, at least, also fundamentally questions, which is the notion of the kind of dialectic or dichotomy between a site and an architecture that comes to it, and a set of a place and something that you bring to it to shape it. I think many of the most challenging questions we face now as architects involve the inextricable and continuous relationship between our occupation of space, the use of resources, and the notion of a kind of we invent wilderness in order to be able to bring technology to it, but neither really exists separate from each other, and that's a really important, I think, realization at a both professional level as well as a epistemological level.
That there's no nature.
Yeah, or there is nature, but we are it as well.
Well, strictly speaking, if there is no nature, there is no culture. At least the collapse has to work on both sides of the divide, right? There's just physics.
Yeah.
But maybe
Yeah.
the question is about
Yeah.
how we know these things, which I think.
Well, I mean, when people always ask me, like, what's the role that computation can make to solving climate change, I always sort of remind them that the only reason we know climate change is happening in the first place is because of the planetary computational apparatus that tells us so, the satellites and sensors, and most importantly, the supercomputing simulations that allow us to model this. And so the first question is honestly, less about computation as only as a technology, but rather as computation as a kind of cognitive technology, as an epistemological technology. I think that's probably the most important thing to continue to be kind of structured. I don't know quite what the
Where that leads.
well, no, I don't know quite what the location of that is,
But this is where I get worried.
whether location is exactly whether they're. But please go ahead.
This is where I get maybe now that we're entering this phase,
Yeah.
I get worried about the kind of universal as a notion in this conversation, regardless of where we place it. And so, we have university is of course dealing with universals. We are living the consequences of coming up with universals in some way and imagining that certain kinds of subjects occupy the space that can speak for everyone else. It seems to me the planetary requires us to think on a level that requires a privileged point of view.
When I mean universal, I mean literally like the table of elements.
Chemistry.
Like this is it's all universal from this. Like this is a set of conditions from which this rest of this ensues. And I would also
Molecules.
what?
Molecules.
Yeah.
Well, with the geopolitics, the ecological politics of molecules is actually one we're quite fraught with. But I mean, the point is well taken about the ways in which a kind of false universality becomes tyrannical and self-amplifying and self-congratulatory. But the same can be said about, the vernacular and the local, and the presumption that the way the world seems to work is the way in which we're going to act as if it does. Text and climate change denialism is also cosmotechnics and an indigenous ontology that we may be more suspicious of.
I guess I would bring it back to I think our larger intellectual overlap, but in his book A Vast Machine, Paul Edwards, the historian of technology, talks about the development of this planetary way of knowing through computation, but there's a fundamental distinction between that he makes between like the knowing of climate change and the doing of something about it, and I think I think one of the ways in which there is a very productive conversation between us in terms of the Antikythera's interest in the epistemology of how we know where we are today, and our fundamentalist interest in MIT in shifting practice and practices at the same time is trying to understand and construct a link between knowing and doing that is not very effective in the context of climate in particular, right? Or that is the fundamental crux of our contemporary challenge is the complete and total knowledge of the nature of the crisis, at least at the scale of planetary science, is utterly divorced from the political and physical mechanisms with which we might and should need to address the crisis. And
no, I totally agree. Which is why I strong agree. And this is why I'm quite excited about the inclusion of both of these kinds of these exhibitions under one roof, because I think is exactly this kind of alignment that we need to be considering. And perhaps to some extent, this divorce of epistemology from politics, or from knowing that versus knowing how. Or what way or another, is another way of speaking to this split in the cosmology that I'm speaking to, right? Like the fact that we have an inadequate politics, though politics also might be the right word, inadequate governance is because of that divergence, it would seem to me.
I don't have a comeback to that.
I think part of what makes this sort of work is that we understand the range of different perspectives that we're coming to this, but also the importance of the complementarity, and I think this is as well. Yeah. Calvin or Nicolay, do you have any last additions you'd like to sort of make for this before we?
Well, in relation to this conversation about like knowing it versus doing something about it, the role of design, the agency of the designer, whatever the designer is, I think also perhaps relates to this conversation as maybe the emphasis shifts away from the agent occupying that position versus the position of agency in the first place. I mean, this is also part of the, I guess, part of the title of the new scene, as opposed to, or as a continuation of the new sphere, which we were referring about. But to understand that, you know, our agency in these systems is different from our subjectivity within these systems, which is different from the identity that we apply to ourselves as architects within these systems, and that unflattening of these three terms maybe changes how we think about us as architects, yada yada, about this, but also changes about how we conceive of the design moving forward once this condition is revealed. So the exploration of the role of the architect beyond that, the role of the designer in the post-new sphere era is something that's inspired the title of this floor, but also I think inspires how you think of the acting within the built environment now that we have both this awareness and also the contributions of various different forms of intelligences at play.
Yeah, and I think maybe just to add on to that, the thing that I am most invested in that is not just the kind of technology and the computation that we've done there, but I think a lot of the projects are also about how we get these ideas into places, right? How we actually mobilize some of this work, and I think a part of it is, you know, lacking governance, the politics of it, but then also, you know, the local knowledge that is kind of the predecessor to all of this work.
I mean, I like the idea that the conclusion is architecture, re-architected, to involve new ways of thinking about subjectivity and agency in the context of doing it.
But I also, just I think Nicolay's point, like, that's very different than the conclusion as architects.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
That the agency, in fact, might be something that actually is in the process and in the procedure and in a kind of institutionality that occurs across much longer timescales than the signature.
Or that there is a distinction between being an architect and being an architect, and hopefully we have many architects, and some architects decide to be architects as well.
For sure, yes. So perhaps that's a great place to start with this as well.
Yeah.
So thanks very much.
Very good.
We're going to do a very quick turnover to the next panel, and thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thank you.